So, the UK, rather secretly, has passed some new legislation, which has been on the table for a couple of years now, which restricts our right to protest. So, I didn't even realise that this had actually happened. And then Calvin Robinson, who does some great work at GB News, actually tweeted about it, saying the police crime sentencing and courts bill was passed last night, and this was on the 1st of March, and this is being recorded on the 3rd of March. So, and he says, the House of Lords previously removed draconian measures to restrict our right to protest. House of Commons put these illiberal clauses back in and then pushed the bill through. Who is covering this authoritarian power grab? So I wanted to answer this question because I thought it was interesting.
Okay.
And just as a little mention, Julia Hartley-Brewer did also cover this, so I'll give her
Well
some
done.
credit.
She gets some props.
She's done some good work at Talk Radio as well.
Yeah.
So giving credit where credit is due. Both of them have been doing some good stuff. So let's actually talk about what it is and what it does, what the situation was beforehand. And coincidentally, you never would have guessed it, but the BBC is one of the few mainstream outlets that actually did report on this.
Oh, good.
Like the only one, really, out of the main 10 that get read. So, well done to the BBC. I never thought those words would come out of my mouth, but there we go.
They did at least cover it. They did the bare minimum.
Yeah, I suppose so. But I don't exactly have high expectations
of the style of or quality of coverage. Yeah.
They carry on like this, maybe I'll actually pay my licence fee.
Well, I know some people who use BBC radio, and it seems to me like this is exactly the sort of thing that would get put on at like 4 a.m, sandwiched between two absolute nonsense stories.
But the thing is that the left likes protest as well, so it's interesting that no one is covering it. Because you'd think that, well, sure, right-wingers who care about liberty and freedom and all that good stuff, well, they would be up in arms about it. But you'd think also the left, they're the ones that are most known for doing these
protests more, because the thing is the left's protests actually achieve things because the left more or less shares the same objectives and perspectives as the establishment. And so when they protest, it's basically like a YouGov poll. They are signalling a public will to power, which can then implement the things they want. And they've been doing this for decades, by the way. So whether it actually hinders them or not remains to be seen. If it hinders what they can actually do to protest, that might still be in their interests, because it means, okay, they can't have as much fun smashing stuff up and going for a protest party. But if they still just turn up, pictures taken, media makes a big fuss over it, ministers make policies, they get what they want, maybe it doesn't affect them. The people who are really affected are the right wing, whose protests never work because the establishment is entirely against them. It thinks their worldview is anathema, and the police always go heavy on them whenever they can. It's going to affect them because the police, who have so much discretion already, have the discretion to crack down even harder on them.
Yeah, and I very much agree with your point that the effectiveness of protest in general is dependent on how receptive the government is to the message being conveyed in the first place.
Remember the Iraq War protest?
Yeah, as 1 million people turned up.
1 million people turned up in London, queues everywhere. Even the media was reasonably supportive. But nothing happened. Changed absolutely nothing.
Well, I actually wrote an article about whether protests work. I looked at all of the protests towards the Iraq War, and it was amazing. Like, at any one time in the world, there'd be millions of people protesting it. It was kind of amazing to see. Yeah. And it was all around the world for months and months and months, and it didn't do a thing to stop it, did it?
Nope.
So looking at this BBC article, first thing it mentions is what powers did the police have before, because they're focusing on the actual protesting aspect as well, the controversial element. But it also does lots of other stuff, which I will mention, of course. But they said police could only restrict protests if they demonstrated that it would result in serious public disorder, serious damage to property, or serious disruption to the life of the community. And that quote is there. That's from the previous legislation.
That was the law before?
Yes. And it's got harsher still. Of course, they could impose routes on marches as well. But what about all of the kettling and the student protests and things like that? I don't see any serious public disorder, serious damage to property, or serious disruption to the life of the community in the scenes I saw protesting in London in 2010, 2011. I know, it's not exactly evenly enforced, is it?
If that was the rule, I'm sceptical as to whether they had any intention of following it.
Yes, and one other thing that they could do is that protests for major events were also agreed a week in advance or more.
So that the police can get in more muscle, usually.
Yes. I mean, I can understand the reasoning behind it in that, if you're going to protest, we want you to do it peacefully, not violently.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, we want to know about what you're doing, who you are, what your aims are. I mean, okay. I mean, the fact that you're having to tell the state that you're doing it, though, kind of defeats the purpose of protest a little bit.
Well, I don't know. I think it's useful in a sense.
You don't want people blocking major roadways.
It does make protests a little bit more orderly, and the stuff that we really want to avoid is the Insulate Britain style thing, where people are blocking the M25 and causing people to end up with permanent life-changing injuries because they can't get to hospital, things like that. Basically, it's supposed to be an outlet so that you can protest without having to resort to the direct action nonsense, which this ruins everybody's lives and can be very, very damaging. The things we've seen in the American race protests, riots, things like that.
Mostly peaceful race riots, yes.
Yeah, mostly peaceful as the sky is red with burning buildings.
That's probably the low point of my life following politics. That America was burning and they were denying that anything ever happened. It's just like, oh no. It's like the most depressing thing ever. So the BBC outlines what changes with this new legislation, and it says police chiefs would be able to put more conditions on static protests, such as those organised by Extinction Rebellion where roads and bridges are occupied. Fair enough. I mean, transport links, blocking them off, it's kind of annoying for most people, and there are other places you can do it without being
they deliberately choose the places where they can be the most disruptive to people's lives, because that's what they want to do. They want to get in people's faces. It's in their... I've read their manifesto.
I mean, why don't they protest outside of hospitals? And I know it's not good PR per se, but they can really get on some people's nerves if they wanted to. Protest outside of a mosque. I'd like to see some leftists do that. So they would now be able to impose start and finish times on protests, which seems a little bit much, doesn't it? Set noise limits as well. Again, seems a little bit extreme to me.
I wonder how much of this is in response to the truckers' protests we've seen during COVID.
Oh, this has been on the cards for far longer than that. I think I covered it must have been late 2019 almost, that they had it in the works. It's been going for a long time.
But I wonder whether some of these details have been particularly targeted at that.
Maybe. I'm sure it was probably considered. It's not like it's exactly very difficult for them to understand. It's only Canada, one of our former colonies, so... They're going to be keeping an eye on it, for sure. Also, these rules apply to a demonstration of just one person.
What?
I know. So apparently, if a single individual was holding a placard while sharing their views via loudspeaker and refused to follow police directions about how they should conduct their protest, they could be fined £2,500.
The thing is, it occurs to me that the police directions about how they should conduct their protest... I feel like the police have a lot of leeway and just be arbitrary and tyrannical.
Well, of course,
You must conduct your protest while standing on one leg and hopping once a minute. Maybe not quite that.
The legislation deliberately avoids defining specific terms to give them that leeway to do whatever they see fit.
Yes, and it seems like this vague language is going to end up being tested in court.
Oh, yeah, of course. It also will become a crime to fail to follow restrictions the protesters ought to have known about, even if they had not received a direct order from an officer. Which
sometimes I can see where that would be useful. So if the restriction is they're literally blocking an ambulance and things like that. But yeah, so much of it is vague, and lawmakers love a good vague law. It allows them to be as authoritarian as they like, and keep up the fiction that they thought they were acting within the bounds of law and decent common sense.
Apparently, at the present, police need to prove protesters knew they had been told to move on before they can be said to have broken the law. So they have to be aware of them having an obstruction in the way of, say, a road or something. This is designed to stop people occupying public spaces, hanging off of bridges, or employing other similar tactics.
You can protest, but you can't occupy public space. Interesting. I mean, I know that in some contexts, yes, the occupation of public space.
How benevolent of the government to allow us to protest in our own homes. That's very kind of it. I'm sure the Scottish government will be one to kind of outdo us, and they'll be like, yes, protest in your own home.
Well, in a way they have, if anything you say is offensive.
That's true, yeah. So there is some good stuff. It's not all bad. Okay. They've added some sprinkles to this giant dog turd. Another measure that clarifies that damage to memorials could lead up to 10 years in prison. This follows the toppling of the statue of slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol. It's worth pointing out that he wasn't just a slave trader.
Right, yeah, he did loads of stuff. He was a philanthropist of the old school.
Yes, I think the reason he had a statue in the first place was that he donated lots of money to the city of Bristol.
Built huge areas of the city.
Yeah.
But then I just recall that the people who toppled that were declared, oh no, they didn't do nothing by the jury.
Yes, and that's part of the reason why they've added this clause in, that 4 people accused of illegally removing the statue were cleared of criminal damage.
Why? On what grounds?
I don't know.
I thought my impression of that, though I may be misreading it, was that the jury basically, having been informed of all of the law and everything, and it being an open and shut case, just decided they would ignore it, they would acquit them, because that would be the good thing to do for the climate and for their cred on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yes, I feel like it was a loaded jury. There is an extent
to which it doesn't really matter, in some cases, what's written in the law, if the juries are subverted.
To be fair, in Bristol, if you get 4 people at random, you will probably get 4 raging leftists anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that. So there is some other stuff thrown in as well, just to let you know about some of the other things that are not protest related. So they changed sentencing rules so that serious criminals would spend more time in jail before they can be conditionally released. Good. Judges will be allowed to consider jailing child murderers for their entire lives. I mean, fair enough. If you're killing people, you should be in prison.
I mean, personally, I would call up Mr. Pierrepoint, but that's my opinion.
Maximum sentences for low-level assault against emergency service workers would be double to 2 years. That's already quite low, isn't it? Poor emergency service people just getting
literally
assaulted.
Especially paramedics who are called to, rough inner city areas, ghettos especially, and just get the ever-loving beaten out of them by the locals who are completely barbaric in some cases. It's not on.
On terrorism, the bill would create powers to more closely monitor offenders released from prison. Fair enough. We should be monitoring potential terrorists. Fine.
Yeah, but who does the monitoring? And there are so many of them that we just sort of gradually turn into a surveillance state. The idea is, right, with prison release, if the justice system is working, then when you are released from prison, that's it, right? Clean conscience, you've done your time, blah, blah, blah. But that's not the case. You continue to be punished long after you've served your sentence. That's rather Orwellian, actually. I know that, yes, there are practical examples where it would be useful in this country, but the fact that we've reached this point where we're relying on that is very, very disturbing.
Yeah, I think my main objection really to the monitoring people is that they expand it to a level that's just ridiculous, where, monitoring people should be explicit to people who you have good intelligence on being actual Islamic terrorists, right? Maybe IRA as well. So you got 2 criteria there that you can look up. Like, are they Irish Republicans? Are they Muslim? Right, there we go. Job done.
No comment.
I'm not saying monitoring every single one, but,
in combination with terrorism charges. Well, a terrorism sentence having been served.
And they also say community service for less serious crimes would address underlying problems in offenders' lives. Bit wishy-washy. However, if it's a community sentence, I suppose they're not really being severely punished anyway. And charges to sexual offences... Changes to sexual offences law would tackle abusive adults in positions of trust, such as sports coaches and religious figures.
Good.
Well done.
Good,
yes.
And also school teachers, I would like to add, but I don't know if that's covered already.
I imagine that would probably be covered amongst all the other things.
You'd imagine so.
So apparently this has been opposed, obviously not. Unfortunate segue from the sexual offences, but no, the protest aspect has been opposed by Labour and the Lib Dems. Never thought I'd be on their side, but there we go. Apparently the Shadow Secretary Yvette Cooper says the legislation has been rushed and will create an incredibly widely drawn powers that would allow the police to stop and search anyone in the vicinity of a protest, including passers-by, people on their way to work, and peaceful protesters.
Yeah, I wonder how long it'll be before we have our very own World Economic Forum stormtroopers on the streets of Britain with ridiculously widely drawn powers and no accountability.
Thanks for that dystopian vision. Terrifying.
We've already seen footage of it, so it's not far away.
to return back to the fact that the press haven't really covered this, I'm going to look at some of the actual coverage. So one of the first ones is for Conservative Home, and it's by a Conservative MP cheering on the government, and he frames it as a bill that's protecting women and girls, apparently.
Great.
So yeah, just focusing on one element. Also,
Wait, you mean you don't want to protect women and girls, Josh? What a horrible person.
it's just like, yes, we're going to give you compulsory beatings, but also we're going to protect women and girls. And you're opposed to this? Disgraceful. But no, it's also worth mentioning that the Conservative Home website is an interesting place to publish an article because, of course, a quarter of all Conservative Party donations are from the property development industry. So, funny little marriage of interests there.
So this is a Conservative Home then is a property development area?
I don't know, but it's just relating to property, isn't it? And they're they're dog whistling to their own audience, so to speak. And another one in the big issue was written by another Conservative MP. Seems like the only coverage in the press is from actual Conservative MPs writing in support of it, saying it's an opportunity to axe the Vagrancy Act, which it actually does, which is a 200-year-old law against people sleeping on the streets and just basically having to move them on. I don't think they necessarily get arrested. They're just like, oh, you can't stay here. And they move them on to somewhere else. And I mean, this isn't necessarily the best optics for a Conservative Party that presides over a country described as being in a housing crisis and ruling over a rising cost of living. Just like, yes, we're going to remove the vagrancy laws, so...
Well, seeing as you're all going to be on the streets shortly,
yes, exactly.
Then we may as well decriminalise it. Wow.
Yeah, a little bit foreboding. And then the next one from INews is one of the few that actually covered it properly. I never thought that would be the case. They talk about Tory MPs turning on Boris Johnson as he pushed through plans to introduce new restrictions on protest at a time when Ukrainians are dying for the beliefs and for the rights and freedoms of speech and freedom of association, all that stuff.
Nice try.
I butchered the reading of that.
No, not you. I mean, that's sort of really attempting to shoehorn Ukraine into this discussion.
Well,
I bet if this debate had taken place 8 days earlier, then it would have been about COVID.
Yeah, it probably would, wouldn't it? And not to give the Eye too much credit, there's another article by them which reads, a year on from Sarah Everard's death, it is clearer than ever that police are not serving us. So yeah, it's not like not like they're necessarily on side. And this talks
about... This is the thing, right? So a lot of people look at our generally hopeless Conservative government and then very occasionally they do something that's actually Conservative and people stand up and they're thinking, oh, yes, they're standing up for our things. But then when you look at them, I believe that the people doing that stuff are just old school authoritarians. Like they're giving themselves more power, yes, to crack down on something that Conservatives don't like, but the common thread is all more power, more power, more power. And yeah.
No, I think the Conservative Party needs to be destroyed. I'm very much on the Peter Hitchens approach. Yes, I think they're evil. I think they're an actual socialist party.
Conservative Party delenda est.
Yes. I genuinely believe that they are an openly socialist party now. And I think that our choice between light socialism and heavy socialism between the Conservatives and Labour is outrageous and disgusting. And Conservative politicians, I can't remember which Labour politician said it, but they are scum.
Right. I mean,
I'm going to stand by that.
Steve Baker, Conservative MP, I think he came out and said, why are we a socialist party now at one meeting?
There are some good Conservatives,
but they are usually.
They are a handful of MPs.
But remember Rees-Mogg, for example. Now, I know he's a bit of a Marmite figure, but he was actually reasonably good at some periods of Brexit when he was involved in the European Research Group as a backbencher. Then he got into government, and he has been towing the line ever since. I've hardly heard a peep out of him. Yeah.
And confusingly enough as well, Amnesty International were another that covered this bill being passed. And they actually did some pretty good coverage of it, describing it as deeply authoritarian legislation, which it is, fair enough. So there we go. By the end of this, I've agreed with the Liberal Democrats, Labour, Amnesty International, and the eye. This is very
This is what
strange.
politics does to you.
Strange bedfellows, isn't it? But yes, this was basically just fallen by the wayside, and I wanted to draw attention to it.
Yeah, because
And
it is
also,
important.
It is important, and also the fact that no one's really reported on it, even though these are massive changes to our right to express our political beliefs. And yet we haven't heard about it, and that's very strange to me.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as this premium podcast between Carl and Thomas on the origins of the Dark Enlightenment. Very spicy indeed. And if you want to follow Carl, you can also follow him at Getter at Carl Benjamin. Thank you and goodbye.